Does anybody?
Go ahead.
Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Security Seminar at Purdue University. Today's speaker is Dr. Dennis Moreau. Dr. Moreau is the co-founder and CTO of Configuresoft. Dr. Moreau has over 20 years of experience in evaluating, designing, and managing software systems. He's a specialist in the application of leading-edge technologies in complex problems within the IT management domain. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Moreau.
Thanks very much for inviting me to be here. Today we're going to be talking about some aspects of virtualization security and the characteristics not only unique to virtualization technologies, but unique to the ways that virtualization technologies allow environments to be managed and some of the things we have to consider with respect to security in that area. Just to facilitate doing that from the other side so I can see the same screen you guys see, I'm going to move this way. Try to go full screen. How's that working for you? Can you see it fairly well?
Yeah, looks good.
All right. My background is primarily computer science, primarily in distributed systems and systems virtualization with respect to massive amounts of data and visualization. So if you have any questions along the way, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'll be moving pretty sprightly through the material, trying to do some introductory stuff, but I'm assuming you know a lot about operating systems and system software and to some extent security. Is that fairly consistent with you guys' expectation? Cool. So from our perspective, we're going to be addressing virtualization, the new concerns it introduces, resource sharing, how that changes those security concerns, what it means to couple both behavior, security posture, and the reactions that we have to have in virtualized environments, especially those environments that are deeply virtualized, more than one level of virtualization. We'll talk a little bit about security configurations with respect to virtualization and what kinds of tools you leverage to get a handle on the problems that we're describing. What can you do about it? So not just throwing grenades saying, here's a problem, but also pointing the direction toward what kinds of innovations would make a difference and help us make some headway against the problem. So classic virtualization, what we essentially have is hardware in the environment, guest operating systems, and these operating systems have configurations. If they're Windows, they have a registry, they have DLLs, they have APIs, they have applications. All the stuff you used to have to do on normal operating system environments, you still wind up having to do. But now they're co-hosted, and I've got another layer of technology being interposed. That layer of technology has configuration information associated with it. There are APIs. There are settings that determine the performance, the behavior, the security, and the availability of those systems. Those are settings that we're contending you have to pay attention to when you do virtualization. But there's some interesting interactions that accrue consequently. There's some good stuff that happens with respect to virtualization. If I virtualize my environment, I'm creating a level of abstraction and normalizing the interfaces that my operating systems have to see. That means I have less diversity. Less when I provision my operating systems. When I deploy Windows XP across a large environment, I've got less variation to worry about behind that layer of abstraction in order to provision things. So I can concentrate on doing fewer permutations so I can spend more time on those individual permutations doing the care and feeding of those particular permutations. So reducing diversity is a good thing with respect to security management. We get some degree of sandboxing. There's some degree of insulation associated with virtualization. It can prevent some sorts of exposure. It certainly isolates guests to some extent from other guests and from the underlying hosting environment. That is both a benefit and a challenge. We'll talk about that in a minute. Rapid deployment, it becomes much, much easier once I have a virtualized image to say, I want more of those in the environment, press a button and have lots more. That's also a benefit in allowing you to be more agile. It's a challenge in terms of having lots more things because you can do them on demand when you need them and you're not waiting for purchase order processing or someone to run down to CompUSA, right? In addition, you get re-imaging where that's appropriate. So if I decide this environment has changed in a way that I don't want, that I don't expect, and I want to get it back to the way I had it before, that's very, very easy. Where that's appropriate, hold that thought. We'll wind up getting an increased control over network activity because those extra layers of abstraction allow you to control behavior across those layers of abstraction. So you're able to tune things in just a little bit more interesting ways. You wind up getting some insulation for specific vulnerability types from exploits there, and you wind up getting an ability to do exploit analysis to be able to reverse engineer what malware is doing in controlled environments so that you can understand those better, draw conclusions from that in terms of how you should react, but also develop even counterattacks associated with this stuff. Now, virtualization accomplishes its magic using three basic fundamental characteristics. The first of the characteristics is insulation, creating a sandbox in which I insulate one asset from another so that that hosted asset, that guest operating system, believes it's the only guy on the box. To the extent that that's possible, then this guy can't break because you virtualized him. I can take a physical asset, move it to a virtualized environment, and not have it know the difference. That's the good side of insulation. The downside of insulation might be I've got agent instrumentation on that box looking for malware, looking for any spyware, looking for stuff. What can he see? Only what's in that box. Virtualize the guest, you virtualize the instrumentation, and to some extent the visibility you have into the overall environment, unless you do something else, something specific to virtualization. Independently, there's lots more sharing. The reason you virtualize very often is I want one piece of underutilized iron, one big fire-breathing box that had a 5% utilization, to get used a lot more efficiently. Good news. But I am also causing the hosted environments, the guests that sit on that piece of iron, to now share host bus adapters, caches. I'm having them share processors, sharing NIC cards, sharing all sorts of stuff, and that sharing has an effect that affects security posture and coupled behavior. We'll talk a little bit more about that subsequently. Finally, dynamics. When it's very easy to provision new stuff based on need, based on demand, I'm going to do that. And when I do that, I'm changing things. Not only am I changing things in terms of spinning up new things when I need them, I'm tearing down old things. I'm also able to, through dynamic migration or vMotion and the more proprietary technologies, take an asset here and move it over there while it's still running. So my ability to track assets based on MAC addresses and IP addresses and all sorts of contextual stuff that you can assume when things are static and have a fairly fixed relationship, all of a sudden need to be able to be a lot more flexible in a more dynamic environment. Virtualization infrastructure, the plumbing under it, never has been perfect. Very unlikely to be perfect. For example, here is CVE 2008-1944. So, serial number for vulnerability. It's in 2008. It's number 1944 for that year, right? And in this particular vulnerability, what we have is the possibility of executing arbitrary code in an underlying host from a guest. If I could exploit this vulnerability, and this one I believe is on Zen, right? I have a guest exploiting a vulnerability, taking over the underlying host. What's the implication of that? If I own the host, what happens to all those other guests? So did I just couple, to some extent, the security posture of all of those guests by simply co-hosting, right? And of course, you get from that all the affected platforms, which happen to be just about all of the Zens. More interestingly, coupling happens in the environment as well. Here we have the University of Michigan exploit, something that came out, I believe, also at the beginning of this year. And the idea here is that I've got an asset. I decide I'm going to dynamically migrate it from one host to another. And because I'm dynamically migrating it from one host to the other, if I insert a man in the middle, there's nothing keeping me from altering the bits in flight, so that the virtual machine that started here is not the virtual machine that's executing over there, right? All of a sudden, you see real impetus behind the recommendation that we isolate the vMotion or dynamic migration LAN from the transactional LAN, and we isolate that from the application-specific local area networks. All of a sudden, virtual machine hosting environments have lots of physical NICs or lots of VPN configuration to separate network traffic so that it's not very easy to get exposure to the ability to do this, right? We'll go into a little more detail subsequently. So the point, virtual infrastructure, whether it's at the application virtualization, the server virtualization, the storage virtualization, or the network virtualization level, has never been perfect in the past. It isn't perfect today, and it's very unlikely to be perfect into the future. What that means is that we have to pay attention to the controls with every new introduction of those layers of technology into the environment. We have to pay attention to security controls in particular, and almost all of those are articulated through APIs where we can get configuration settings about how are these things configured in the environment. They also create a degree of coupling. Where sharing occurs, some interesting things happen. This year's Black Hat, we had Invisible Things Labs representatives, including Joanna Rutkowska, talk about taking over the Zen hypervisor. The interesting thing here is they used the glue chips. How many of you know what the Q35 chipset for Intel does? DRAM controller controls the address iteration for DMA activity. So the idea is, of course, subvert the kernel, get a domain 0 kind of privilege by whatever exploits you can manage to get that kind of privilege. Then use the DMA controller to set arbitrary target address for your source address, and use the DMA transfer to move your code into the kernel, right? Into the hypervisor, actually owning access in the environment. Now, this is due to a flaw in the Q35 firmware. Intel has released the patch for that firmware, which was a prerequisite to Joanna releasing the rest of the documentation, the code, if you will, for how to exploit this thing. So to her credit and to Invisible Things credit, they decided we're not releasing the exploit code until there's a patch out there for people to deal with, until it's been validated, and indeed that stuff has happened. However, what's the relevant security concern from an enterprise perspective? What do I need to know the impact of this in my environment, given I know there's a patch, and I know the version of the firmware that has the problem? What do I want to know? Where in my environment are those Q35s? What version of firmware do they have? And are they running something like Zen as a virtualization environment in the environment, right? When I know those things, I can make the right decisions with respect to security posture for the overall environment. But I need to know those very intimate configuration things to get there. This is just a little bit of detail on how it worked. By the way, the full paper that includes the source code and the complete description of the stuff over the last week or so since Intel released the firmware has now been posted at the Invisible Things Lab site. It's called, I believe it is Presentation 2, or Part 2 of Owning Zen in the Owning Zen trilogy from Black Hat. So you can get it right off the internet and really understand this in all of its gory detail. Very interesting work. What's the impact of virtualization on security in general? Well, of course, it doesn't automatically create perfect security boundaries. And that's because the flaws in the underlying software. Now, where do those flaws come from? How many of you have written 100,000 lines of code in a single application? 300,000 lines. 750,000 lines. Okay, so Microsoft Hyper-V, 100,000 lines. Zen, 300,000 lines. How many of you believe those are going to be bug-free in the near future? So, what you don't get is perfect security boundaries. What you do get is very, very effective software that you can use if you control appropriately for emerging vulnerabilities when they occur. If you can put the right controls in place to deal with managing these assets, they deliver huge value. So you really want to do precisely that. The virtualization stack is a system. I have multiple virtualization levels. Nobody deploys server virtualization without also deploying storage virtualization. Why is that the case? When I vMotion an asset from here to here, does it need its file system? Oh yeah. So if I'm going to have the file system available when I vMotion this thing from one place to another, how nice to have an iSCSI-based SAN behind the scenes so that I can get at everything I need to get to. So I'm doing multiple layers of technology, all with their own configurations, all with their own vulnerabilities. I've got to manage this as a system. I cannot do the divide and conquer thing and manage each individual layer of technology in isolation. They aren't separable. They are actually indeed tightly coupled. Resource sharing in the stack creates some coupling and boundary conditions that we'll talk about in more detail, which is the primary focus of this presentation. And separately, virtualization security implies that you're going to be monitoring more controls, more layers of technology, and have more constraints than you ever had when you weren't virtualizing. Just the heads-up comparison, and we'll make that more clear. That is the point of this presentation. So if I haven't touched that base by the time this presentation is over, you really ought to let me have it. Server virtualization is not the only kind of virtualization. We talked about storage virtualization lightly, but basically the idea is this. We have servers, we have storage. We understand how to deal with this part of the network, which is the internet and the LAN in our environment. But the storage network on the flip side of the fence, almost every problem we've ever had on the internet side in terms of spoofing, in terms of being able to do buffer overflows, in terms of being able to do stuff to compromise environments, has an analog that exists on the storage side of the network. So if you get Duaveri's book on securing storage, you'll get to delve into WWN spoofing and mutual authentication from either end of a host bus adapter out to an iSCSI SAN and all the stuff behind the scene. The real issue is when I deploy a new level of technology, I am deploying interdependent infrastructure that has configurations and has vulnerabilities, and we have to do something about it to effectively get the value out of the environment. These are more of the vulnerabilities, and these are the ones that are articulated, for instance, in the reference. Himanshu's book is just absolutely great in that it identifies the vulnerabilities, demonstrates how you can demonstrate the vulnerabilities are there, exploits if you will, and what to do about them in some very interesting ways. On the SAN side of the fence, where you have essentially a storage area network attached through usually iSCSI or fiber channel of one kind or another to be able to connect things together, there's some interesting effects, but it applies specifically to the transport protocols themselves. So we're hearing best practices emerge that essentially mandate doing mutual authentication on either side of the connection, being able, in some cases, to do encryption on those things in order to connect the root of trust all the way from the spindle back to the TPM module in the server. There's even more recommendations that are emerging. Some of these are showing up in regulatory mandates. So the Defense Department has a complete STIG about how do I configure the SAN with the 32 high-level controls that are the minimum required to use SANs in their environment. So we're even seeing it in the regulatory space. Application virtualization is almost as interesting in that we have in that circumstance an attempt to avoid DLL hell and collisions into registry entries, right? So the idea is this. On my end unit, sandbox the registry, sandbox the file system, sandbox the things that normally might collide when I have two applications fighting each other for the same settings, and instead give each application the view that it's got its own set of configuration out there. Now that's great, but what does it mean when I audit this end unit, this workstation that's sitting here that now has virtualized applications in its environment? Well, how many registries do I have to pay attention to? I've got the one the operating system sees in terms of the settings that affect its behavior, performance, security, and availability, but I now have a different one that the application is paying attention to, and depending on which application namespace I log into, those settings for this guy's registry may look significantly different than these. Which do I audit? When I get the NIST, SANS, or CERT checklist and I start looking through these things, I actually have to look at this guy's with respect to application behavior and security, and this guy's with respect to the operating system, and if I have 6 applications, well, I've got to do it multiple times, right? So what happens in application virtualization is that we've split to some extent by sandboxing and insulating applications from each other. We're forcing ourselves to audit more permutations of the context, which we rely on to determine did we indeed do what we needed to do in terms of configuration. But it doesn't get much simpler when I use the thinner forms of virtualization. So if I'm doing desktop streaming and I've decided, oh, I want all the configuration back on the server where it can deal with it with more sanity, I still have a place where the guy's web surfing here. If a rootkit gets installed, it's going to be here. Well, what happens to screen scraping in that environment? How much of what I see on the screen do I want on an IRC channel? God knows. So the awareness in virtualization, the ability to pay attention to how virtualization is articulated and what dependencies show up in the environment, and more importantly, where are the locus of assessment that I have to pay attention to in order to determine do I have a compliant/secure configuration, becomes just a little more complex. And in fact, in this circumstance, where I detect the problem, that is, I might audit an environment, see that the configuration settings are in the wrong place. Do I want to change those settings out on the endpoints? No. The locus of detection and the locus of fix are in 2 different spaces now, right? So I have a little bit more complex management problem to pay attention to as well. Network virtualization also is within the scope of things. And the interesting thing here is that when I virtualize networks, one of the things I'm doing is giving each guest operating system a virtual NIC. Kind of cool, right? More than that, they run faster than any real NIC because I'm going over a bus to communicate between these 2 guys. Really cool. But what does that mean for my network-based intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems? How much of the traffic between these 2 guests is this external guy going to see? Not a lot. Can I do something about that? Absolutely. I can take the code that's here and inject it into the stack here and essentially have my mal-traffic detector sit on the IP stack inside the virtualization host. Is that a great idea? Well, it's a good idea at least, right? But what does it mean? When I have anti-spyware and anti-malware engines distributed across my environment, what do I do every so often? Update signatures, right? Now, where do I have to update additional signatures on every host that now has a stack that either has a whitelist, a blacklist, or heuristics to determine malbehavior? I now have another update problem. All this says is that when I do deep virtualization, I have more to do in configuration security posture and configuration management than I ever had to do when I wasn't virtualizing, and it's part of the story, right? Let's skip through latent assets and provisioning and skip right on to the compelling issue here is that virtualization with the flaws that we've pointed out, and they're not really flaws that anybody else doesn't have. All large software systems have significant number of flaws. We're just going to recognize them as they emerge and need to do something about them. So this is nothing new. But the new values are, I get huge improvements in efficiency. I get one piece of iron that I'm managing and procuring. It's generating a certain amount of heat, and it's taking up a certain amount of floor space, and I'm getting more work out of it. Hallelujah, I'm going to do more of virtualization for that reason alone. I also get better agility because I can easily provision and re-provision environments. New business need shows up, I can be more responsive to it. New business problem shows up, I can address it more rapidly. I'm going to do it for that reason. Virtualization can deliver, doesn't inherently and automatically do it, but can deliver the same amount of work for less power because I'm getting this better efficiency, a greener sort of mechanism. And given that many, many corporations are running into the wall in terms of being able to get more power, more floor space, more air conditioning, they have a reason to virtualize to be able to get the headroom they need to be able to grow. Finally, virtualization still reduces cost. And what that means is with those compelling drivers, we're going to do virtualization. Fait accompli, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen aggressively. What we have to do is wrap our heads around the idea that we're going to do the work it takes to manage security in those environments despite the additional complexity. And we're going to. More than that, there's lots of very specific guidance to help us get started. Baseline, this is where you should start about this from very authoritative sources. In fact, let me emphasize, lots. So let's look at a couple of them. From Gartner, we have one of their original documents about what are the dimensions along which security changes when you do virtualization. The point's here not to know any of this stuff, just to know that Gartner made a statement, and it was pretty comprehensive. In fact, it was 17 pages and 6,483 words. Enterprise Management Associates followed on with a lot of the stuff from Andy Mann, and we wound up with more information in that environment. In addition to the analysts, we had the consensus guidance work from the Center for Internet Security. Note here we have, I believe, the generic virtual machine hardening guidelines, the Zen guidelines, and of course their CIS guidelines for ESX. Those have since been updated for a new version of Vmware, and we're going to see more stuff coming from them in terms of Zen as well. We'll even see some Hyper-V stuff as that stuff emerges. Note, very interestingly, we're getting a little bit further along in the process, and we get more participants, including the Defense Department. This is the Defense Department's guideline on virtualized storage configuration, just to give you some inkling about what some of those 32 high-level controls are in controlling storage area network configuration in those environments. We also get guidance from the Defense Department on configuring and managing a particular virtualization server, and look what just happened to the content size. 82 pages, 117 plus controls, and about 27,000 words worth of guidance, right? And this is to meet, of course, those requirements. We got information as well from the vendor as we've updated from them ESX 3.5 and ESXi, so we get additional guidance dealing with additional new features, new capabilities, new insights, and of course, new permutations of the platform, permutations that don't have a console operating system sitting on top of the virtualization environment. So we've seen the split between the hypervisor and the environment in which you get access to and manage the hypervisor. Interestingly, as the guidance from VMware came out, we began to see lots more diversity in what they were addressing. So we're seeing the guidance address not just how do I configure this hypervisor layer, but how do I configure all of the relationships between the hypervisor and Virtual Center and other hypervisors and all of the various consequences. So there's a realization that's emerging that the hypervisor operates in an environment where there's lots of interfaces, lots of interactions, lots of things to control, lots of things to pay attention to, lots of places to apply best practice configuration. Best practices, by the way, aren't adequate to getting to the point where you've done the job in terms of security. They simply articulate the things you can leverage, the things you can automate in order to free up the time so that you can do the rest of security, which goes everywhere from business risk and governance all the way down through organizational policy articulation and all of the security stuff that has to be done in order to complete the story. This simply takes some of the drudgery out by giving you a best practice place to point to so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time anybody decides to embrace the technology. Big picture, well, we've got lots of guidance, as I suggested, from lots of sources about lots of things in virtualization. The good news is not where these guys are different. The good news is where they are coherent. We've seen a convergence and a consensus emerge as to what's the most important stuff to pay attention to in managing virtualization stacks, whether it's storage virtualization or alternate virtualization, server virtualization mechanisms. Similar guidance will emerge on application virtualization side of the fence, network virtualization, and all the other forms of virtualization between. Let's talk about coupling. Coupling is the idea that when I start sharing resources of any kind, the assets that share the resource wind up coupling to some extent the security posture and the behavior of the assets. The next 4 examples are attempts to make that concept very, very concrete. The first is, of course, that I've got 3 different servers, and they have 3 different sets of memory, 3 different address spaces, and 3 different working sets in terms of the application running on them. How many of you are familiar with the concept of working set? What happens when the working set of an application exceeds the amount of physical memory that's there? Paging and swapping, right? Because the working set is the amount of memory I need to keep this thing running. When the physical memory is less, then I'm starting to reference outside of those pages, so I start causing page faults, right? So I start slowing things down, sometimes by a lot. But the good news in this environment is that that happens here. What do I affect? This guy. Nothing else is affected. Now, co-host those guys and virtualize them. And all of a sudden what I'm concerned with is the sum of their working set sizes. And it's when that exceeds physical memory that I have to worry about page faulting occur. Now, if page faulting starts to occur, I start swapping out pages for these guys. What's the effect on these guys? Yeah. Now, suppose I take advantage of those features in a virtualization server environment that sandbox the memory. That says, okay, this guy's going to behave. He's never using more than 1 meg of memory. He's not using more than 2 meg, and he's not using more than 3, and together I've got 6 meg of memory on the system, right? Now, suppose one of them starts using more working set size than the memory you've allocated to him. What's going to happen? Page faults. So the host bus adapter is going to start getting loaded down with his page faults, and what does that mean for the I/O availability of these guys? Note the bowl of jello syndrome, where I push in the behavior and try to control it on one edge, it bulges out someplace else, right? Let's look at another example. This time, the host bus adapter, right? So we're looking at the other end of the system. We've got hosts, they have their host bus adapters, and those host bus adapters have cache. And they have cache, why? I'm reading sequential blocks of memory that are bigger than my ability to stash those into my variables in the program, right? What happens with the controller? So you're going to say, oh, you read that memory last time. You're likely to read these in the future. Am I going to cache the whole sector? If I'm smart, I am, right? So they all have their own cache. If this one does Gaussian distributed access, this one does normal, and this one does sequential, the host bus adapters will use the cache for whatever access pattern these guys are exhibiting. Now, co-host them. They have virtual host bus adapters, but there's one real cache here. This guy does lots of sequential accesses, loads up the cache. This guy does lots of random access. This does a different distribution of random access, and now this guy gets his turn again. What just happened to this guy's cache? How effective is it? So if cache is important to the behavior of an application, I've just coupled the performance of these applications by co-hosting them. They shared a physical asset, hence their behavior was coupled, right? Now, is there something you can do about this? Oh, absolutely. Monitor the cache hit rates on these guys at the I/O driver interface, and I know, should I have co-hosted those guys? But what it means is when I decide to provision something onto a virtual environment, one of the things I want to know is there a coherent, is there a sensical co-hosting that can go on there based on the sharing of the assets? Power and HVAC coupling. Very interesting. So lots of data centers. decide I'm going to split my servers up into aisles, and I'm going to cool based on that because I can control hotspot formation and that stuff, right? So suppose I get my aisle pretty heavily loaded, a little bit lightly loaded, pretty heavily loaded, a little bit lightly loaded. I've got more stuff to do, and I've got a very available system out there. Is the right answer spin up the next application over here? Anybody want to take a guess? So this guy essentially is not running anything. What heat is he generating? Minimal. Processors can sleep, drives can spin down, heads can unaccess. I can power down parts of the air conditioning system. Put one application over here, and what just happened? I got to spin up enough to let the infrastructure spin up for that rack, at least the power conditioning system, and probably for some aspects of the rest of the rack, since my air conditioning is unlikely to be as granular as on a per rack basis. Unless I've got ducts for each rack in terms of being able to moderate flow, I've got a problem. More than that, air conditioning systems are very, very efficient near their peak operating load. Turn them back to 20% of that load and they get very, very inefficient. You start spending a lot more money for the per unit work that gets done. They're operating outside of their efficiency zone. So what do I do instead? I make very clear to myself that I understand where there are assets that are essentially unencumbered. And I try not to provision just one asset over there in terms of that one provisioning potentially triggering a whole lot of cost, right? Take, for example, ACPI and policy. There are APIs that allow applications to say, I can tolerate being power moderated in my environment, and other applications which may be very sensitive to latencies and amount of processor they get, and they can declare, I can't tolerate being power moderated. Do not use power management settings while I'm running on you. Now, I've got 9 applications sitting here. One of them declares I can't tolerate power moderation. What does that mean for the processing load for all of the others? The processor on which they're hosted, unless I've got a very decomposable power distribution scheme, split bus mechanism, or individual cores that can go to sleep individually on a die, right? Unless that happens, I wind up having this guy dictate the power policy for every last one of these. This processor, in general, is going to be running flat out, regardless of the power management settings these guys can tolerate. So the awareness of my application's ability to tolerate should tell me where I should provision this guy. You want all the guys that can't tolerate power moderation running in the same locus, right? So that the other guys can actually power down, go to sleep, use high efficiency modes, run at lower speeds, learn at lower energy consumption rates. More than that, I need to know the same thing for aisles and where I'm provisioning. All of a sudden, what I need to know to decide intelligibly that I should be able to dynamically migrate that virtual machine from here to there is a lot more information than I ever needed to know when I wasn't virtualizing. Interesting coupling. We talked about the owning Zen trilogy and the ability in that circumstance to demonstrate compromising a system, getting domain zero access, taking over a DMA capability, and writing right into the hypervisor code that you want to put there, right? What is the thing that was shared that puts systems at risk? That is, if I compromise this, which systems could be compromised? Was it only those systems that were sitting on one ESX host, or was it any system in an environment? Or was it only those systems sharing any server virtualization host? Well, indeed, that is the circumstance. What I'm seeing is that all the systems that share the same DRAM controller, the glue chip down there that's controlling address space strobing, right? That's the thing that was in common. So what did I need to know to determine where security postures were coupled? Where those guys were sharing potentially physical address space. That's where I got into the ability to get here, right? More than that, if I can take over in the hypervisor, then all co-hosted assets now become a possible target, right? Now, the good news, there's a patch. The really important news is understanding where the most important places for me to get that patch out first and what's the impact on risk. And more importantly, could it have been compromised any time in the past, right? I want to know that stuff in order to manage compliance, risk, and of course, the security posture of the assets I'm managing. So, coupling this concept that when I share stuff of any kind, that I wind up sharing security posture and behavior becomes a fundamental concept, not just in virtualization, but in utility computing in general. What are some of the other places that coupling occurs? Well, of course, memory, especially NUMA, right? Non-uniform memory architectures mean that if I know I'm here and my affinity is to this processor and my data is over there, then I get a much higher penalty than if I can co-locate those things. The ability to understand memory allocation and the NUMA architecture and have that affect provisioning and how I control memory in virtualization becomes pretty important. NICs. We've already seen the guidance associated with isolating the NICs, the transactional LAN from the operating system's NIC from the NIC that's used to do migration. They all need to be different and insulated from each other. We wind up having the need to deal with virtual switch infrastructure in specific ways. Some ways are much more efficient than others. These are right out of, in this case, the VMware best practices guides. And of course, the SAN, audit the configurations that are there and understand that the configurations in virtual storage are aligned with your configuration with the virtual server and that that's aligned with the configuration of the application virtualization environment. Only when they're all aligned do I wind up having the service or application stack in a solid security posture on all of its supporting layers of technology. Regulatory coupling. Even the PCI folks, the guys who make the regulations that determine how much you pay and whether you can or not do credit card processing for the Visa side of the fence, have acknowledged a level of coupling. And the level of coupling is essentially showing up here. First, they're interested in credit card processing to make sure that there is physical or logical network segmentation in place to separate credit card processing facilities from non-credit card processing facilities. This has been interpreted by PCI auditors to be extended to separation in virtualized environments as well, although not consistently interpreted. We wind up having the load balancing environments where I might have multiple member cluster behind a firewall or a dispatching mechanism of some sort, right? And now I want to be able to determine and validate they're configured appropriately. Well, can I do that? Can I talk to a load balancing system, inspect this system, and then inspect this one and inspect this one? What happens? I do the first query, the load balancing system directs me to that server. I do the next query for the next registry entry, and it directs me to this server. I do the next query, and so all of a sudden I'm getting this distributed sampling across all of the members. That doesn't work. So what they require is that the customer provide an attestation that indeed those systems are synchronized, and whatever their configuration, they're all alike. It just sidesteps the problem so that it's the customer's responsibility to audit things that are part of a load balancing firewall distribution mechanism. So we wind up seeing that the regulatory guidance, the regulatory mandates, are actually having to make provision for the sharing of infrastructure and the impact on that on both visibility and coupling of security postures. More interestingly, where coupling occurs, for instance, we have two applications, the SAP system with your social security number and pay stub in it, and the football pool. Right? The football pool, how aggressively am I going to patch that? Not real aggressively. How aggressively am I going to patch the SAP system? It's mission critical. I'm going to spend what it takes to get it secured. Now, they share here the storage area network. If one's going to get compromised, which one's it going to be? The football pool. Suppose it does. And it takes over the virtual hosting environment, controls the host bus adapter, executes a WWN spoofing attack, and redirects the SAN traffic to an IRC channel out on the internet. And at the same time copies all the traffic back here so nobody knows that that just happened. Note that what just happened, by sharing just at one layer in an application stack, I have coupled the security postures of two applications, the football pool and the SAP system. Not something you always want to be happening without you being aware of it and without you putting appropriate controls in place. If I decide when I co-host that I'll pay attention to this guy because he becomes a potential foot in the door, lock him down just as tight as I lock down this stuff, then I'm okay again. All of the objections that we've raised are things you can do something about. You just have to recognize them and do something about them, right? You are paying attention to a level of control that you didn't have to do in non-virtualized environments. But how much time do we have left? 10 minutes? That means I've got to talk even faster. Okay, I can do it. So from our perspective, there's another part of the picture here. The coupling happens not just at this techno-geeky asset level, not just in terms of configuration settings, but it happens in terms of risk from the big picture perspective. One way of dealing with this is something MITRE is calling the risk map methodology. And the idea is this, that I can decide what my business objectives are and how important they are. Then I can decide for each of those business objectives, what are the operational tasks that are required in order to realize those business objectives. Then I can decide which information assets get used to do each of those tasks. Then I can decide what network nodes support those information assets, supporting those operational tasks, supporting those business objectives. When I create that lattice-like scaffolding that lets me understand how important is this node because I've connected it to that business objective. If at that point I get a new vulnerability that applies to this node, I can then chase that vulnerability knowing how important is this asset because I can see its footprint and impact on business objectives. I've got a context. I can look at the CVSS score and say, does that high CVSS score mean a hill of beans to me if it only affects the football pool system? Or does it apply to SAP and do I need to patch it with some dispatch, right? Only by understanding this lens, which focuses an understanding of priority and impact on the business, can you decide in a really risk-managed way which things ought I do first. You can't determine that down here at the asset level, where all I know is the configuration of the asset, the threats against it, and the potential risk score for it. That tells me nothing of the significance of that asset. The idea that I can take governance decisions and business objectives and refine them into a lens that IT can then use to be able to decide what do I do first and what do I do most urgently, where do I invest most aggressively, winds up being precisely what this can deliver. Now, this is a possibility. This is a methodology that has been used in critical infrastructure management, needs to be adapted to be applied to virtualization, but a very interesting one. So let's compare non-virtualized environments, and this is the last slide I'll dive into to open the floor for questions. Non-virtualized environments to virtualized environments. The non-virtualized environment, we always had to pay attention to applications and operating systems. More than that, we mapped our policies, external guidance from NIST, SAN, CERT from anybody, and best practices into the configurations of these things so that I did the best I could do and I made sure I met regulatory mandate and I was consistent with my own policies. Easy enough? Now, how many ways could the settings here conflict with the settings here? That is, how many ways could the application collide with the operating system? Well, only a few, because they use exactly the same settings, right? So I could say the time to live that makes the operating system run efficiently is not the same time to live that makes the application run efficiently. If the application talks to lots of assets, I want a really short time to live, so I turn loose those kernel resources for those IP connections so I can use lots of them. If, however, the operating system talks to only a few because of shares, I don't want the overhead of tearing down settings and bringing them back up again for sessions, so I want to cache those. Those are at odds with each other in terms of kernel resource utilization. One setting is right, one for the other or the other, but they might be in conflict, right? Deeply virtualize that same environment, and we get a slightly different picture. Now I've got to map policy, external guidance, and best practices into all these levels of technology, all of which happen at different sorts of APIs with different settings, all of which have to realize a particular policy and set of perspective on this stuff, right? But ask the question, how can they interfere with each other? And I got a nice little combinatoric explosion out here, right? Because I can say, turn on full disk encryption here and affect service levels up there, if there is a penalty for doing full disk encryption. Right? I can decide that I'm going to take my virtualization server and I'm going to implement a policy that partitions where I provision things, and that will affect the resources available to the web services environment that's going to be there. Lots and lots of interconnection here, and if I don't know where the interconnections are, I might take my checklist, assess this guy, see there's a problem, and change something, and what might happen? Unintended consequences. Right? So let's leave it there. So what we've talked about today is that virtualization has some differences from non-virtualized environments, and that we almost always deploy virtualization in multiple layers. We've described a little bit about what some of those potential vulnerabilities are and what we do to manage them. More than that, we've described coupling, which is the idea that when we share in virtualized environments, a very important aspect of virtualization, that we complicate decision-making both about vulnerability assessment, mitigation and remediation, and ongoing provisioning in those environments. Then we talked a little bit about what that means in the final assessment from the big picture risk assessment and from the complexity point of view in terms of understanding that when we do virtualization, we've got more to do than we ever had to do without virtualization. The bottom line and the thing to take out of the session is that when you do deep virtualization, in order to get all the benefits of virtualization, you need to know more about configuration at more levels of abstraction than you ever had to know about when you weren't doing virtualization. That's a little counterintuitive because when it comes to provisioning's easier, right? I press a button, bang, I got a new system. That seems to have you knowing less. until you have to decide where do I provision it, how's it configured, how's the rest of the stack configured, what's the security posture. All of a sudden, I've got to know more, and more across more disciplines. How many of your colleagues, friends, or co-students do you have that know a lot about SANs, a lot about virtualized storage, a lot about web services, a lot about SAP, a lot about Windows 2000 XP, Vista, and the alternative operating systems that might be in the stack? Note that where you specialize is where you're going to get really good. It's very hard to specialize across all of a technology stack. It means the guy you keep locked up in the closet, you probably need 2 or 3 of them in order to be able to do recommendations on this on an ongoing basis. Questions? Or insults? How many of you are interested in using virtualization or getting some deep proficiency in that for your environments? Go ahead. How many of you have any experience with virtualization, either Xen, Vmware, ESX, Hyper-V, now that that's RTM? 0?
So we have a problem even if one of the virtual environment gets,
Sorry.
even if one of the virtual operating system gets compromised, then the whole system is at risk. Is that the thing?
No, that's potential. So
That's
there has
potential.
never been in the real world a compromise of a guest that has actually taken over a hosting environment and taken over, therefore, the co-hosted guests, at least not that we know of.
What if there is a problem in the virtual machine VMware itself?
Well, and there you get to the point. There are vulnerabilities which VMware and Xen and everybody else that builds hypervisors have acknowledged that if the vulnerabilities were successfully exploited, could allow arbitrary execution of code in the underlying hypervisor. So there's vulnerabilities. What I'm saying is essentially we haven't seen the massive attack that would hit the headlines nor that would be publicly noticeable. While the vulnerabilities exist and in principle have been demonstrated by security researchers, right? We have proof of concept. What we don't have is that having been a problem. Yet, it is the existence of a vulnerability that creates the responsibility on the part of a technology user to do something about it. It's not responding to the exploit, by then it's too late. It's responding to the vulnerability with appropriate controls and management so that you control the risk, the probabilistic exploit, not the actual exploit of the environment. So risk accrues and responsibility accrues by existence of the vulnerability, and they exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Other questions? Thank you very much for your time in this. I hope it was useful. If you have any questions, my email address is on the back of these presentations and that'll be posted. So don't hesitate. I'm intensely interested in this stuff and I miss dealing with grad students and even undergrads. So thank you very much. Joel.